Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Black. I'm the Executive Director of Fix Democracy First, and you're joining us here for our voting rights panel in the screenings of Suppressed 2020, The Fight to Vote, and Suppressed 2021. And we're joined today by two panelists that I'd like to introduce. First up, I will say a little bit about Fix Democracy First. We are a pro-democracy organization based here in Washington State, and we work on everything from voting rights and access, money in elections, getting big money out of politics, and civic education. So welcome. And so now I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Giovanni Severino. He is the lead policy organizer with the Latino Community Fund. He is a passionate activist and is an advocate for social justice. He was born and raised in South Los Angeles, California. While he lived in LA, he participated in multiple marches such as the May Day March and the Occupy LA March. His family moved to Yakima, Washington when he was 17 years of age. Since then, he has engaged in community efforts to improve the livelihood for marginalized communities in the area. He attended the Yakima Valley College, where he earned an associate's in arts and served as the Associated Students of Yakima Valley College Director of Student Programs from 2015 to 2016. He's a recent graduate from the Central Washington University, where he earned his Bachelor's of Science in Political Science. He served as the Associated Students of Central Washington University Student Body President from 2017 to 2018, and is the co-chair of the Mecha de CWU. He is excited to be a part of the Latino Community Fund to ensure that all communities get the representation they deserve. Welcome, Giovanni.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And our second panelist is Brianne Schuster. She is a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington, where she fights to protect and advance the civil rights of Washingtonians. She has successfully litigated a number of cases challenging unlawful election systems, leads trainings on the right to vote, and continues to work to reduce barriers to accessing the franchise and meaningful representation. Brianne received her JD from Seattle University School of Law and her BS from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in dance and Spanish. Welcome, Brianne.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
So we're going to jump right in and start talking a little bit about the film. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourselves and why you do this work. How about you? Start with you, Giovanni.
Yeah, once again, thank you all for having me here today. What really calls me to this kind of work is recognizing that there is a good amount of people working very, very hard to make sure that we don't have an opportunity to voice our opinions, ask for things that we need for our communities to thrive. And that just doesn't sit right with me. There must be a reason why folks want us not to thrive in our communities, right? And, just seeing that, and it calls me to stand up for not just my community, but all communities that are being targeted by this very oppressive system, especially like the electoral system, which we will be talking about today. That's really what calls me into this kind of work. And also just, as mentioned in the bio, and my apologies, I recognize that bio was really long, but I was born in South Los Angeles, California. Many people recognize it as South Central, and grew up in poverty, grew up in communities that did not have the necessities that we all need to even just survive, and that's not okay. And recognizing that I have those life experiences and knowledge and education, I feel like it's not only just an honor to do this kind of work, but also a duty of mine to do this work for all of those that may not have someone to fight for them or have a voice out there for them. That's why I do this kind of work.
Thank you, Gio. That's really good to hear. We're happy to have you doing this work. It's really necessary. Brianne, how about you? Why are you involved with this work?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Giovanni. I agree with so many of those reasons for why I'm interested and got into this work. For me, voting is sort of where I began my concentration or my practice when I was an attorney. And I think one of the reasons for that is voting is so core, not only to our democracy, but to accessing all of the other rights that we, have and should be able to access and practice and protect. So one, it's from whether we have elected officials that are making decisions about our healthcare, about our education, about what communities are resourced, and then electing or appointing, judges to make decisions on how these rights are protected or advanced. And so at every level, voting is such an integral part of how we're ensuring that everything else, that our communities are thriving, that we're resourced, that our rights are protected.
Thank you. Yeah, very important work. So I want to move to talking a little bit about the films, Suppress 2020, The Fight to Vote, and Suppress 2021 by Brave New Films. And I do want to acknowledge the Social Justice Film Institute that's helped sponsoring this event and sharing these films, which are really important. What was a moment in either of the films for both of you that stood out and why? Brianne, let's start with you.
Sure. I love that question. In both films just really like the whole film really had such an impact on me. And so it's hard to pick out kind of one moment, but I think the theme, two themes I think that really stuck out to me and that I really carry. And one is just how powerful the right to vote is. And I think that's shown in how much effort there is to suppress it, right? Like our voice really is powerful, and having that voice is so critical. And if it weren't, then we wouldn't have so many efforts to suppress it at a systemic level. But I think what was really incredible to me and what I continue to fight for is just witnessing the perseverance and persistence of people to really access that right and to make their voice heard. I think it can be, just the fight that people are putting up is so incredible and really inspiring, and just that always stands out to me.
Thank you. How about you, Giovanni?
I agree with what Brianne said. Just the themes of both films of, showing that resiliency, right? To ensure that their voices are heard. The first thing that stood out for me, though, in the first one, on the 2021, was the number of polling locations that were closed since 2012 in Georgia, right? I wish I had the number right in front of me, but I saw that. I remember that it affected close to 1,200,000 eligible voters in Georgia. And that stood out to me because I was like, whoa, like they're working really, really hard to make sure that these folks don't vote, right? And that infuriated me. But throughout the film, just seeing the resiliency from the community, seeing folks do whatever they can, not only to shed light on this issue, right? But to encourage fellow voters to participate and to speak up and to work through these obstacles that have been put by these individuals, right, that don't want folks to vote. Them guiding them how to properly go through the process, right? It was just, and I say properly because it's like these are just laws meant to be obstacles to make sure that people don't vote, right? It was just amazing to see the mobilization of folks, the passion behind it. And then on the second film, the 2021 one, I wish I would go to church as more often than not, right? But it was nice to see that that the church community created a campaign to vote. They called it the Souls to the Polls, and I was like, yo, that's really nice. All sectors of our communities recognize that it's important to vote, and we're working really hard. And I would say even harder to push back against the narrative saying that, that the right to vote isn't necessarily a right to everyone, right? And we're fighting to say, no, it really is. It's us voicing our opinions and as individuals of this society that contribute to the society, we should have the right to voice our opinions as well as to where we want our whole country to head towards. That's what really stood out to me about these films. And although, like I said at the beginning, it was like, oh, what the heck? Towards the end, it was just more of that sense of feeling good and recognizing that, you know, we're not in this fight alone, and we're going to continue to fight harder to ensure that our voices and our opinions are heard.
Yes, definitely. I'd also add that was one statement that stood out for me in the film is that it only takes just shaving off some votes here, shaving off some votes here, suppressing the vote a little bit here, like you mentioned, closing all those voting locations and what an impact that had on the community. But it seemed like there was attack from a variety of different standpoints, and you could tell it was really just a deliberate attempt to prevent people from voting. It's so obvious. Let's move on to the next question about here in Washington State. You know, we do have quite a few things that actually are working well for us. How does Washington State compare to other states when it comes to voting access? And, you know, what is working? What do you think needs more attention? Brianne, why don't you start?
Sure. So no, I think this is a great question. I wish I had as good of an answer though as the question. And I think in part it's just hard to compare, for me at least, states because, you know, in any state where you're not able to access the ballot, that's a problem. So I think in Washington, a couple of the things that I think we are doing well, albeit, you know, improvement, are that we allow for mail-in voting, and that it's fairly, and that you don't have to pay for postage in order to vote. So I think that that's really important, and that there are opportunities for folks to vote in person if that's not accessible to them, and just around, you know, the ability to vote if you don't have like a permanent mailing address. So if you're houseless, if you're moving a lot, I think that's really important. With respect to that, I think one of the things that we can always do, you know, to improve that is ensuring that people who are younger, who are moving a lot, are able to register in time, know where they're, you know where they're supposed to be registering, when they're supposed to be registering. So there's still a lot of public education with that. But I think two of the biggest, or I guess sort of three of the biggest issues that I see that we still have in Washington. One is with respect to mail-in voting, we use a signature matching system. So, you know, you sign your signature and then somebody looks at it and says, okay, that looks like the same as your registration and your ballot. And we have a really significant problem in a number of counties in Washington where people of color and predominantly people that with Latinx sounding last names are having their signatures disproportionately rejected. So there's actually a lawsuit that was recently brought, I think earlier this year, with respect to that in a number of counties. So that's one issue. A second issue is that we don't actually allow everyone who should be eligible to vote in Washington. So people that have a felony conviction, for example, are prohibited from voting while they're still incarcerated. And we know that there are, you know, the reason that people can't vote with a felony conviction is really rooted in racism and systems of oppression. So that's another, I think, barrier that we need to get rid of here in Washington. And the third thing that we have that I don't know is necessarily unique to Washington, but is not in every state for sure, which is our at-large election systems. And so almost every jurisdiction within the state of Washington utilizes, or, you know, some combination of at-large and district-based elections. And these often, depending on voting trends, have the potential to dilute the vote of communities of color. So I think those are three arenas, and I'm sure there are more, you know, that we can work on, but those are three that really stand out to me.
Yes, thank you. Those are all good points. Giovanni?
I feel like she hit all the points that I was gonna bring up as well. So that's you know, it's good to hear that other folks, you know, are working on the same thing, right? Yes, and I actually live in one of those counties that is that is currently dealing with that mismatch signature problem right here in Yakima County. That's it's been an issue here as well. The voting in district in the primary and then at large in the general Same issue here in Yakima County. So everything you said is, I agree with you 100% that those are some of the issues that I see, being a barrier for equitable representation across the state, right? Um, and I do want to mention though, on for folks that were formerly incarcerated, this last legislative session, a great coalition of great organizations worked really hard to ensure that folks that were formerly incarcerated get their right to vote immediately once they're out of prison, right? No more having to wait to pay those fees, or not being told what the process is, or being aware that you can get your right to vote even after you're outside, from incarceration. So, although Washington is not perfect just yet, there's a lot of organizations that are working really hard to make those changes. And one thing that actually came to mind as well was automatic voter registration. We should really start, continue pushing that work forward. I remember when I first voted, it just, it was amazing to me. I was like, whoa, like they make it really easy for you to learn about the election itself, like who's running, why they're running, why are they running, the pros and cons, all the good stuff. And then, the ballot is mailed to you. You don't have to pay for the postage. It's just, I genuinely really love voting in Washington. It's fun for me. And I would just like to spread that to other folks that should and are eligible to vote, but just aren't aware of it because they haven't registered. And it's a simple act, right? And to me, I would think, hey, automatic voter registration is great, and I think we should have it here. And for folks that say, we're more about like having the opportunity to choose whether or not we could register, I would say, why not just automatically register you and then you choose whether or not to vote, right? So definitely would like to see that change here in Washington State. And I do recognize that for myself, like I really do enjoy the opportunity and the access for folks to vote easily here in Washington State.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm so oh, sorry, Cindy.
Go ahead, Brianne. No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you mentioned the coalition work to improve on our Voting Rights Restoration Act, which makes it a little bit more easy for people who are recently incarcerated or recently released from incarceration to vote, because that was such a monumental bill that was passed this year. And I also can't believe that I forgot to say we have the Washington Voting Rights Act, which we worked really hard. I know others worked really hard to pass, and I think is showing how important that is right now, especially as we're seeing the Supreme Court chip away the Federal Voting Rights Act. So I guess that's another really important piece of legislation and protection that we have here in Washington that is not in every other state.
I'll also add that we also have the Native Americans Voting Right Act that passed the following year that allows for alternative addresses and other access to voting for Indigenous communities in our state, which is really important. I do want to just address something really quickly. You said, Brianne, about signature matching. One of the things we can now do in Washington is also pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds. That was part of the Access to Democracy package that passed in 2018 for automatic same-day pre-reg, the Voting Rights Act and the Disclose Act. Many young people don't even have a signature. They print their name, and that can be very confusing. And signatures change over time. And we do know that the stats are saying that it definitely has a more impact in communities of color. And so I think that's a really important issue, that though we've made a lot of strides in the state, there's still a lot of work to be done. And we're all part of different coalitions that are working on this. One other thing I'll mention real quick is that the restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated persons will kick in January 1st of next year. So it did pass this year, but it'll be in place January 1st of next year. So let's move on to the next question. From your experience, what are some of the biggest threats that you're seeing impacting voting and democracy in the country today? Because there's a lot there's a lot going on across the country and other states. And I also want to mention there was a couple of recent Supreme Court decisions that also impacted voting and disclosure and things like that. Giovanni, what do you think some of those big threats are?
The first one that comes to mind is the big lie. It's, this, we have a group of individuals that are pushing out this message to cause not just confusion, but doubt in the electoral system. And mind you, we've used this form of voting nationally, statewide, or even locally, right, for many, 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 many years. Um, Voting by mail here in Washington, we've used that for, I would say, a few decades, right, like a couple decades or so. So it's not something new. And this big lie that is being spewed out, right, I think is honestly probably the biggest threat, because it's starting to influence lawmakers into pushing policies that will limit voter access just because of this big lie. It's really scary for me, I'm a big history nerd, and this is a scary thing to see. Um, but I think we can work, together to push the right message and to bring confidence and trust, right, to our electoral system. Because at the end of the day, elections happen because folks want to voice their opinion, and we should all have the same equitable access and equal access, right, to voice our opinion by casting in that vote. Just because one person lost an election, we shouldn't completely dismantle this system that has been, that we've been used for a while now. Yeah, that's honestly, to me, I feel like that's the biggest threat right now. And, I urge folks to do some research to figure out, like, okay, like, if the narrative is that there's fraud, right? What does the fraud look like? Where does the fraud come up? Because even those who are doing the investigations right now have not put any objective information out there showing that that is the case, right? So definitely, I still encourage folks to trust the system, and if you don't necessarily ask questions with the intention to learn, not with the intention of just attacking or trying to make a point, right? But yeah, that's, to me, I feel like the biggest threat right now.
Thank you. Brianne, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think misinformation and just a lack of accessible information is such a big issue right now. And building off of all of the things that Giovanni said, which I completely echo. When we're faced with kind of misinformation about how prominent voter fraud is, or how voting works, it's not only resulting in more and more barriers and oppressive systems, it's also making it so that people, when you don't trust the system, why would you vote, right? Like and so it also discourages real democracy, and I think that's a really unfortunate consequence as well. And I think along with that, whether it's driven by quote unquote fraud or other reasons, or what our real goal, in a democracy should be, is that every single person should be able to vote and should be able to have their voice heard. And it doesn't matter, if we agree with them or if we think they're going to vote for a particular party. The whole point of having a democratic system is that everyone is able to make their voice heard. And so I think just that idea of sort of politicizing voting or making it a partisan issue is really problematic when it's really ingrained, like in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, that this is a fundamental right. And we've just had this sordid history of persistently preventing particular populations as a country and as a state, frankly, too, that we don't think are going to vote the way that particular people in power want them to vote. And so many efforts to disenfranchise and erect barriers to accessing that right.
Yes, these are all good points. I will mention that 17 states so far since the 2020 election have passed some type of voter restriction. Many of those are being challenged in the courts, but based on how the Supreme Court decisions are coming down, we're not sure how that'll play out. But and then there's also those, I don't want to even call it an audit that's like happening in Arizona and other states looking to do that, to continue to try to undermine the election, like the big lie that Giovanni mentioned. So the work continues, and it's going forward in not so good of way in some places, and other states are expanding voting access because it works, like mail-in voting, for example. So it's an interesting time in our country's history, that's for sure. So let's move on to some possible solutions. Right now, there's national legislation, including the For the People Act, which passed the US House of Representatives, but is currently stalled in the Senate, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that's going to be reintroduced here coming, I think within the next month or so, which will be like I mentioned, which will be introduced probably, I heard, in August, maybe. How do you think these bills might help with voter restrictions that are currently being passed in some states? And why are this legislation important on a national level? Brianne, you want to start?
Sure. And I think another thing I should have mentioned that probably is worth at some point discussing in terms of our democracy is the Electoral College, but that's for another, we can talk more about that later. So
you're welcome to throw that in too. That's a really big issue.
So yeah, I think there is a lot of exciting legislation both at the national level and I anticipate at the local level as well. Both in cities are doing really interesting things in Washington, and I think there's going to be some opportunities for the state this year. So that's to just build upon, the Washington Voting Rights Act and other protections that we're trying to advance. But so sorry, with respect to the two sort of pieces of legislation that you mentioned, Cindy, and I'll admit I'm hoping others can chime in a little bit, but I understand that the John Lewis legislation, or the Voting Rights Advancement Act, would basically reinstate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And for people that don't know, that's more or less the preclearance requirement, which means that in order for certain types of jurisdictions to change their election systems, they have to essentially get like approval. And that used to be in our Federal Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court stripped it a number of years ago and sort of made it basically ineffective. So I think that that's a really exciting idea. I think there's been some conversation of putting forth a similar bill in Washington. And I think there's a lot of potential there. The one thing, and what I like about the two bills is that I think they work really well together, right? So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would have an impact on future election systems that are adopted. And my understanding is that the For the People Act would also have an impact on prior or current existing election systems. And so that act has a lot more measures. I think it has automatic voter registration, which you've also talked about, Giovanni, and other steps to just advance our elections that I think are really critical. Same day voter registration, I think allowing for more changes at the polls and early voting, and more opportunities to vote by mail. So all of those things are really great. I think there's also within that bill, though, and one thing that the ACLU has had concerns about is some of the disclosure requirements. And so we're hoping that some of those issues will be addressed. But I think the provisions regarding voting specifically are really great and have an opportunity to really advance voting at the federal level. And I think that's so important as each state is starting to like chip away in their own way. We really do need national legislation to ensure and protect people's rights.
Giovanni, what's your take on those? I actually want to echo everything Brianne said. I being honest, I don't know too much about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, other than what you mentioned, Brianne, regarding the pre-clearance part, right? Which essentially would be the main part of the act. But for the People Act, yeah, you know, pushing same-day voter registration or automatic voter registration, or you know, increasing access to voting through the option of voting by mail, right? And I want to stress option, right? Because it'll be an option for folks to either vote by mail or vote in person, right? No one's coercing anyone to, oh, you must vote by mail, right? But yeah, you know, it's all an effort to increase access, right? This whole politicization of you know, just the access to vote it's really toxic for our nation, and we really do need the federal government to take action and just, you know, from a, you know, I would say like logically, right? You look at the bill and it says it right there, like it aims to increase security, you know, for the election process, but it also aims to increase access. Those are both good things. Why would anyone want to be against that, right? So honestly, that's just my take. And like I said, I agree with everything that Brianna already mentioned. I just think it's something that needs to happen. It needs to happen soon. Because right now our politics aren't the best, and really stabilizing the the electoral process would improve that, hopefully.
Great. I'll also add the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is basically to address the, like Brianne mentioned, the court decision Shelby County versus Holder from 2013 that basically gutted the pre-clearance, saying that, oh, racism really doesn't exist, so you don't need that anymore. Well, we know that's not true. So it would basically strengthen even the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So we're very excited to see that go through. The For the People Act, in addition to all the voting stuff you mentioned, there's also expanding public funding of elections in there, dealing with gerrymandering, accountability and transparency in government and conflicts of interest. So it's a huge comprehensive bill that right now, as I mentioned, stalled in the Senate because of the filibuster. And I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole, but that's a big issue right now that's happening in the Senate, is the filibuster and how that's preventing legislation. The last thing I'll mention is that polling shows that the majority of people in the country support both of those bills, regardless of their party, including Republicans. A majority of Republicans support the For the People Act. So, but the leadership is a different story. So we'll see how those things move forward. So let's talk a little bit about what people can actually do to help move things forward here in Washington State as well as nationally. You know, what actions do you think people can take locally, nationally to protect voting access and expand democracy? Giovanni, why don't you start?
Well, for folks who are watching this right now, this is the first good step. Being a part of the conversation, right? Of you know, of what can we do, or you know, just gaining knowledge on the issues is a really good first step. What I strongly would recommend in the folks who want to take action to do, right, is first, you know, join one of the organizations or any group, right, that is already working to ensure that voter access isn't restricted. When it's time to testify for bills that will be introduced in the legislature, which happens to be every year for folks that didn't know, right? Definitely like join in and testify, right? Testimonials are from 1 to 3 minutes. They can be a little nerve-wracking, but after you're done with it, you're like, hey, that wasn't too bad. And you make a positive change to your community, right? Well, statewide. And then I also encourage folks to do the same locally in their local city or town or community, right? More than likely, there is a city government where you live at, right? For folks that are watching this. And there could be individuals that are elected officials who are pushing the same rhetoric or pushing misinformation about the electoral process. Show up and speak out against that. So those elected officials are aware that there are community members that are here or wherever you are fighting to ensure and won't go back, won't allow anyone to restrict their right to vote, right? I really strongly, my bad, I encourage folks to definitely stop by their city council meetings, participate in those. It's something really easy to do. And a lot of times, oh, sorry, I accidentally pressed the space bar. A lot of times I feel that folks just think this is too big of an issue to tackle as an individual. And that is not true. You as an individual have so much power with your voice, with your own presence. Your mere presence, just being there, is a big impact. So don't be afraid. Testify if you can. Go to your local city council meetings, and then just have these conversations with your friends as well. It's really good to start talking about these things and take action as well.
That's all good advice. What would you like to add to that, Brianne?
Oh, I'm not sure if I can, but I mean, yeah, all of that is so great, Giovanni. Thanks. And I think the only thing I would just sort of add on, but I think it's so in line with what you're saying, is I think it can feel so easy to be defeated with, especially with like what's happening at the federal level for many folks. And it's just such a good reminder that like our local elections really matter. And you know, there are council elections, there are county elections, there are city elections, there are county elections, there are state elections, and there are opportunities to engage with those, all of those levels of government, whether it's submitting public comment or testifying, and electing those officials. In Washington, we elect our judges for better or worse. And so I think really, you know, there are a lot of good resources, and there still could be so many more. So if you want to see anything, please let me know, because that's something we're always trying to improve upon, is making democracy accessible and making sure people have the information they need to make, you know, choices for themselves. So yeah, engaging with local politics and local elections and your representatives, I think, is just really important. And when you see a problem, I think Suppress was so good at showing that, like, when you do see a problem, finding an organization or an entity to explain that to, because I think there are a lot of organizations that are doing this work, but we can't always see what's happening on the ground everywhere. And so, you know, the more that you can share your experiences and what you're seeing, that's super helpful. And there are people that want to be fighting for your right to vote. So.
Yeah, I think that's so important, especially the local elections piece. You know, a lot of focus gets on the national elections, like especially presidential years when we see the biggest turnout. But those local elections affect your everyday life and have a huge impact. And like Giovanni says, you know, attend those meetings, show up at those things and get involved. One thing we didn't mention, but it is a redistricting year. So right now, that's going on here in Washington and across the country. And we encourage people to, if you're interested in getting involved with redistricting and in your community, to making sure that maps are drawn in a fair and equitable way, is you can actually go to the Redistricting Washington website, and there's a lot of outreach meetings that are going to be happening in July. And we encourage people to get involved with that process. That's something you can do right away. And testifying, like Giovanni says, you might be a little nervous going in, but they're usually like 1 to 3 minutes, and you just need to get your opinion out there. And they do want to hear from the public. So that's one great way to get your voice heard. And they are asking people to testify before the Redistricting Commission. So that's one area you can probably participate in right away. So how do people get in contact with you if they have more questions or want to get involved with your organization? Giovanni, how would people get in touch with you and the Latino Community Fund?
At my Latino Community Fund email, which is just Giovanni@latinocommunityfund.org. I'm always checking my emails. I get a bunch of them. It's just a heads up, but definitely you can reach me there. And you can also find me on our webpage at latinocommunityfund.org. We also have a Facebook page, so make sure you like us there. Really, I just hope, if you do reach out to me, I look forward to conversating with you, because I definitely like meeting new folks and talking about issues like these to make sure that we're all working together, and pushing the same message forward, in which is equity and access for all, right? When it comes to voting. And yeah.
Great. Brianne, how about you? How can people contact you or the ACLU here in Washington?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll also share my email. So it's my B as in Brianne Schuster, SCHUSTER at ACLU-WA.org. And we can share that as well. We also have normally an intake and referral line in which you can get sort of pretty quick resources and information. It's currently down for the next, I think, couple of weeks. It's just as we're transitioning to sort of a new system, which is a new person, which is really exciting. But eventually, you'll be able to utilize that as well, and you can find more information about that on our website, which is just aclu-wa.org.
Great, thank you. And if people want to reach out to me, you're welcome to do that. Cindy, CINDY at fixeddemocracyfirst.org, or you can visit our website, fixeddemocracyfirst.org, and you can sign up for our email list. And we do a lot of events and things like that, and try to do outreach to people to educate them and inform them about what's happening in democracy in our state and nationally. So we're coming to the end, and I just want to kind of end on an up note. So what words of encouragement would you like to leave for our listeners today? Brianne, why don't you start?
Oh, good. Man, I was really hoping Giovanni would go first. No, I'm just kidding. I think I actually think that, as we were talking about earlier, the video when I was rewatching it, I again got really angry and upset, but left sort of inspired. And I think one of the things that I would just love to leave folks with is it can feel really easy to feel defeated, and the fact that there are so many efforts to make it hard for you to vote just shows how powerful it is to vote and how powerful your voice is. And so I think that's what I would leave as a voice of encouragement: is your voice matters, your opinion matters, and your vote matters.
Thank you. Gio, how about you? How would you like to end people with an up note?
I feel like I said this enough, but exactly what Brianne said. Yes, it's, just keep reminding yourself that if they're working really hard to make sure that you can't voice your opinion, well, then maybe you should work a little harder to voice your opinion, right? It's your voice matters. What you want and need in order to live, right in our nation, that matters. And it's important to speak out, to show up and be present whenever actions are being taken place. And remember that you as an individual, you're a very powerful individual. One voice can really make the difference. One vote can really make the difference. There have been many cases here in Yakima, in the Lower Valley, in smaller towns, where elections have been decided by one vote. I didn't believe it until I saw it. So I'm here to tell you that your vote, your voice really does matter and can really make a difference, not just for yourself, but for other people around you.
Yeah, those are really important, powerful words, that everybody's voice matters and your votes do matter. And I've seen those close elections that one vote can make a huge difference. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, Brianne and Giovanni, for your insights. I also want to thank the Social Justice Film Institute for getting this out there and sharing the films. And I encourage people to share this. Share the links, share the films, continue to talk, continue to get involved, because it matters and the time is now. Don't be discouraged. Continue to fight the good fight. Thanks, everyone.